Imagine it is late July 1944. You are a 20-year-old kid from Ohio, sitting in the cockpit of a P-51D Mustang at 25,000 feet over the skies of Bavaria. Your Packard V-1650 Merlin engine is humming, pushing you at a respectable 430 miles per hour. You are escorting a massive combat box of B-17 flying fortresses, feeling pretty confident because the Luftwaffe has been practically bled white over the last year. Then, out of nowhere, a shark-like silhouette streaks through your formation. It has no propellers. It is moving at over 540 miles per hour, faster than anything you have ever seen in your life. Before you can even thumb your gun switch, it unleashes a devastating barrage of 30mm cannon shells, tearing a B-17 in half, and vanishes into the clouds before the debris even starts to fall. That was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was terrifying, it was revolutionary, and it was entirely doomed. Welcome back to the War Room. If you want to dive deep into the classified files, tactical breakdowns, and the gritty reality of military history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a briefing. Today, we are cracking open the vault on the Nazi Wunderwaffen, the so-called wonder weapons. We are going to look past the mythology and analyze the cold, hard steel, the compromised logistics, and the desperate strategic calculus of a dying empire trying to invent its way out of total defeat. To understand why the Third Reich poured billions of Reichsmarks and millions of man-hours into science fiction weaponry, while their front lines were collapsing, we have to rewind the clock. We have to look at the strategic DNA of the German military machine. This obsession with a technological silver bullet did not just fall out of the sky in 1944. It was born in the ashes of 1918. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles gutted the German military. The Reichswehr was capped at 100,000 men. No tanks, no heavy artillery, no air force. General Hans von Seeckt, the architect of the interwar German army, realized a fundamental truth. If Germany could not have mass, it had to have absolute, overwhelming quality. Every single soldier had to be trained as a non-commissioned officer. Every piece of equipment had to be a force multiplier. This created a cultural obsession within the German high command with tactical and technological superiority. They believed that superior engineering and aggressive, mobile tactics, what we casually call blitzkrieg, could overcome any numerical disadvantage. We have seen this exact same mindset before on our own soil. Think back to the American Civil War and the Confederate Navy. The South lacked the industrial base of the North. They could not build a fleet of traditional wooden frigates to break the Union blockade. So, what did they do? They turned to radical technology. They built the CSS Virginia, an ironclad ram. For one terrifying afternoon at Hampton Roads, that single technological marvel tore through the wooden ships of the US Navy. But it did not win the war. The North simply built their own ironclads, like the USS Monitor, and outproduced the South. The Confederate technological leap was brilliant, but it was swallowed whole by Northern industrial mass. The Germans in World War II were about to learn that exact same lesson on a global scale. As Germany rearmed in the 1930s, their defense industry was structured more like a collection of artisan guilds than a modern, streamlined manufacturing base. Companies like Krupp, Messerschmitt, Henschel, and Porsche were run by brilliant engineers who treated every weapon as a bespoke masterpiece. They loved complex suspensions, overlapping road wheels, and intricate gearboxes. When it worked, it was lethal. But when a transmission breaks down in the freezing mud of the Russian steppe, a bespoke masterpiece is just a very expensive steel coffin. Contrast this with the American approach. The United States arsenal of democracy was built on the principles of Henry Ford: standardization, interchangeable parts, ruthless efficiency. We did not build the absolute best tank in the world. We built the M4 Sherman. It had a 75mm gun and decent armor. But more importantly, it was reliable, easy to repair, and we could build 50,000 of them. The Soviet Union took a similar approach with the T-34, churning out over 84,000 units with rough, unpolished steel, but featuring brilliant sloped armor and wide tracks for the mud. How do you win a war of attrition when your enemy has 10 times the steel, 20 times the oil, and an industrial base that is completely immune to your bombers? You do not. You either surrender, or you roll the dice on a miracle. By late 1943, the strategic reality for Germany was catastrophic. The Sixth Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad. The Afrika Korps was gone. The U-boat fleet in the Atlantic was being hunted to extinction by Allied escort carriers and microwave radar. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was preparing Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that would completely obliterate Army Group Center, tearing a hole 400 miles wide in the German lines. In the West, the British and Americans were gearing up for the massive amphibious invasion of France. And above it all, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was systematically dismantling the German war economy. The US 8th Air Force was pounding targets by day, and RAF Bomber Command was incinerating cities by night. Let us talk about the lifeblood of mechanized warfare: oil. In 1943, Germany consumed about 15 million tons of oil, mostly synthesized from coal or extracted from the Ploesti oil fields in Romania. By the summer of 1944, Allied bombers had smashed Ploesti and systematically targeted the synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr Valley. Aviation fuel production dropped by over 90% in a matter of months. You can have the most advanced fighter interceptor in the world, but without high-octane aviation fuel, it is just a very expensive lawn ornament. Furthermore, Germany was critically short of rare earth metals. Chromium, molybdenum, and nickel are essential for high-quality steel armor and jet engine turbine blades. Without them, steel becomes brittle, and jet engines melt themselves from the inside out. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engine was a miracle of thermodynamics. But because Germany lacked these alloys, the turbine blades were made of inferior steel. They would warp and melt under the intense heat. An American radial engine could run for hundreds of hours. A German jet engine had to be completely overhauled or scrapped after just 10 to 25 hours of flight time. This desperate strategic environment is the exact incubator for the Wunderwaffen. Hitler and his inner circle, particularly Armaments Minister Albert Speer, realized that conventional production could no longer match the Allies. Germany produced around 24,000 armored vehicles in the entire war. The Allies produced over 227,000. The math was terminal. Therefore, the Nazi leadership shifted their faith to radical, unproven technologies. They needed weapons that could bypass the conventional battlefield entirely. They needed to strike London without flying bombers through a wall of Spitfires. They needed to sink convoys without sending U-boats into the teeth of sonar and depth charges. They needed to clear the skies of Allied bombers with a handful of untouchable interceptors. It is the exact same strategic desperation that drove the Imperial Japanese Navy to build the Yamato-class battleships. They knew they could not match the US Navy ship for ship in a post-Pearl Harbor industrial race. So they built a 72,000-ton super battleship with 18-inch guns, hoping a single invincible Leviathan could shatter an entire American fleet. But just like the German Wunderweapons, the Yamato was a masterpiece of the wrong era, eventually sunk by hundreds of carrier-based aircraft, a swarm of cheaper, mass-produced weapons that redefined the rules of engagement. To make matters worse, the German research and development sector was a chaotic, backstabbing mess. There was no centralized, unified command for weapons development, like the American Office of Scientific Research and Development. Instead, the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, and the SS all had their own redundant, competing research divisions. Hermann Göring would hoard resources for his pet aviation projects, while Heinrich Himmler would siphon off scientists and slave labor for SS-run underground factories. It was a feudal system of warlords, fighting over a shrinking pie of raw materials. Look at the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy. They were equipped with the finest armor in the world, the Panther tank. The Panther had sloping frontal armor that a Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate at standard combat ranges. It had a lethal long-barreled 75mm gun of its own. But a Panther weighed 45 tons, and its final drive gear was designed for a 30-ton tank. In the Bocage country of France, under constant attack from P-47 Thunderbolts, these mechanical beasts broke down constantly. Meanwhile, the American Red Ball Express, a massive fleet of 6,000 trucks, was hauling thousands of tons of supplies every single day from the beaches to the front lines. The Americans brought a sledgehammer of logistics to the fight. The Germans brought a scalpel, but the blade was brittle and the handle was snapping. So you have a collapsing front line, a sky full of enemy bombers, a severe lack of chromium, and an oil gauge sitting on empty. Do you consolidate your forces and build proven, reliable weapons for a defensive war? If you are the German High Command in 1944, the answer is absolutely not. You double down on the sci-fi catalogue. Despite this absolute logistical nightmare, German engineers were drafting blueprints that looked like they belonged in the next century. We are talking about the V-1 cruise missile, a pulse jet-powered flying bomb. We are talking about the V-2, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a weapon that would literally touch the edge of space before plunging down on London at 3,000 miles per hour. We are talking about the Type 21 U-boat, a submarine designed to operate entirely underwater, unlike the surface-running submersibles of the era. And, of course, the jet and rocket-powered aircraft. The Me-262, the Arado R-234 jet bomber, and the terrifyingly unstable Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, a rocket plane that climbed at 12,000 feet per minute, but had a nasty habit of dissolving its own pilots in highly corrosive rocket fuel. We also have to look at the human toll this required. The Wunderwaffen were not built by well-paid factory workers in Detroit. They were built by slave labor in horrific subterranean complexes. The Mittelwerk facility, buried deep inside the Harz Mountains to protect it from Allied bombs, was a literal hell on earth. Thousands of prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp were worked to death assembling V-2 rockets in damp, freezing tunnels. It is a grim historical irony that the V-2 rocket actually killed more people during its manufacturing process than it did as a deployed weapon. This was the dark, bloody foundation upon which these technological marvels were constructed, a foundation of cruelty, starvation, and desperation. Within the German military, there was a massive doctrinal clash about how to use these new toys. Take the Me-262 jet fighter. General of the fighter arm Adolf Galland, a brilliant tactician and combat ace, saw the Me-262 as the ultimate interceptor. He knew that if he could mass a few hundred of these jets, he could tear through the American bomber boxes and make the daylight bombing campaign too costly for the 8th Air Force to sustain. He wanted to use the jet to regain air superiority. But Adolf Hitler, completely detached from the tactical reality of the battlefield, intervened. He looked at this incredible interceptor and demanded it be modified into a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber, to strike the Allied invasion beaches. He wanted a revenge weapon, not a defensive tool. This single catastrophic leadership decision delayed the mass deployment of the jet fighter by crucial months, forcing engineers to design bomb racks for an aircraft that was never meant to carry them. By the late summer of 1944, the Allied armies were breaking out of the Normandy bridgehead and racing across France. The Red Army was chewing through Poland. The Third Reich was shrinking by the hour. The conventional war was definitively lost. But deep in the forests of Peenemünde and in the concrete bunkers of the Pas-de-Calais, the countdowns were already starting. The blueprints had become metal. The rocket fuel was being loaded. The most advanced, terrifying, and desperate weapons in human history were about to be unleashed upon an enemy that was completely unprepared for them. The theoretical phase was over, and the prototype were finally rolling out of the shadows and onto the blood-soaked battlefields of Europe. But having a wonder weapon on paper is one thing. Keeping it fueled, armed, and operational in a crumbling empire is an entirely different nightmare. The first of these vengeance weapons to draw blood was the Fieseler V-103, better known to the terrified citizens of London as the V-1 flying bomb, and known to the American and British troops as the buzz bomb. This was not a precision instrument of war, but rather a brutal, crude, and highly effective terror weapon designed to break the psychological will of the British public. The heart of the V-1 was its engine. The Argus as 109 FAR-4 pulse jet. Unlike a modern turbine jet engine, a pulse jet operates using a series of mechanical spring flapper valves at the front of the intake. As air rushes in, fuel is injected and ignited by a spark plug, creating an explosion that slams the intake valves shut and forces the exhaust out the back, generating thrust. This process repeated roughly 50 times per second, creating a horrific, low-frequency buzzing sound that could be heard for miles. The V-1 carried a massive 1,870-pound warhead of Amatol high explosive, cruising at an altitude of 2,000 to 3,000 feet at roughly 400 miles per hour. Its guidance system was primitive but ingenious. It relied on a magnetic compass for direction and a small propeller on the nose that acted as an anemometer. Before launch, engineers would calculate the distance to the target and set the propeller to spin a specific number of times. Once that rotation count was reached, a mechanical mechanism severed the elevator controls and deployed spoilers on the tail, sending the missile into a steep, unpowered dive directly into the city below. For the civilians on the ground, the buzzing sound was terrifying, but it meant you were safe. It was when the engine suddenly cut out, followed by a few seconds of dead silence, that you knew the bomb was falling directly on top of you. How do you defend against a swarm of robotic flying bombs launching from camouflaged ski ramps along the French coast? You cannot bomb all the launch sites, because the Germans hid them in dense woods and heavily reinforced concrete bunkers across the Pas-de-Calais. The Allied response was a masterclass in multi-layered air defense. They deployed a massive belt of barrage balloons to snag the low-flying missiles and massed hundreds of radar-guided anti-aircraft guns along the English coast. These American and British artillery crews were equipped with a true Allied wonder weapon, the proximity fuse. Instead of relying on a timer, the proximity fuse used a miniature radar transmitter inside the artillery shell that detonated the explosive exactly when it passed within lethal fragmentation range of the V-1. But the most dramatic interceptions happened in the air. RAF pilots flying the incredibly fast Hawker Tempest and the newly introduced Gloucester Meteor jet fighter would hunt the V-1s over the English Channel. Because shooting the bomb from directly behind was practically a death sentence due to the massive explosive shockwave and debris field, these pilots developed a wildly dangerous tactic. They would fly alongside the V-1, match its speed, and slip their wingtip under the wing of the flying bomb. With a sharp flick of the ailerons, the fighter pilot would tip the V-1 over, completely disrupting its primitive gyroscopes and sending it crashing harmlessly into the water or empty fields. It was a desperate, high-wire act of aerial acrobatics, but it saved thousands of lives in London. While the Allies were learning to counter the V-1, the German Weapons Directorate was preparing to unleash a weapon that was completely unstoppable. In September 1944, the V-2 rocket entered the war. Designed by Wernher von Braun and his team at Peenemünde, the V-2, or Aggregate 4, was a technological leap so profound that it essentially birthed the modern space age. This was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It stood 46 feet tall and weighed 28,000 pounds, fully fueled. Unlike the pulse jet of the V-1, the V-2 was powered by a massive liquid propellant rocket engine that burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol. This combustion chamber burned at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, generating 56,000 pounds of thrust. The guidance system was a mechanical marvel, utilizing 2 free-spinning gyroscopes and an analog computer that steered the rocket by adjusting 4 graphite vanes placed directly in the exhaust plume. When a V-2 launched, it did not fly parallel to the ground. It shot straight up, piercing the stratosphere, and reaching an altitude of over 50 miles, touching the very edge of space. At the apex of its trajectory, the engine cut off, and the missile began its ballistic descent, plunging toward the target at over 3,000 miles per hour, which is roughly Mach 4. Why was the V-2 considered the ultimate terror weapon of the Second World War? Because there was absolutely no defense against it, no warning and no sound. Because it fell at supersonic speeds. It outpaced its own acoustics. The first thing a civilian in London or Antwerp would experience was a massive block-leveling explosion, followed a split second later by the sonic boom and the roar of the rocket's descent. You could not shoot it down, you could not jam its guidance, and you could not intercept it with fighter planes. Think about the Scud missile attacks during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Iraqi forces used mobile launchers to terrorize coalition cities, forcing the United States military to deploy Patriot missile batteries and hunt the launchers from the air with F-15E Strike Eagles. The V-2 campaign was the exact same tactical playbook, but in 1944 there was no Patriot missile to save you. The logistical footprint of the V-2 was designed specifically for survivability. Instead of massive, vulnerable launch pads, the Germans used a highly mobile system centered around a specialized trailer called the Meilerwagen. A convoy of trucks would pull into a dense forest in Holland, far from the prying eyes of American P-47 Thunderbolts. They would erect the rocket, pump in the freezing liquid oxygen, align the gyroscopes, fire the missile, and evacuate the launch site in less than 2 hours. Despite firing over 3,000 V-2 rockets during the war, the Allies never managed to destroy a single V-2 on the launch pad. However, the weapon was strategically useless. It lacked a proximity fuse, meaning the massive warhead often buried itself deep into the soft English soil before detonating, absorbing much of the blast radius. It consumed massive amounts of potatoes to distill the alcohol fuel, starving an already hungry German populace, and it diverted precious resources away from the production of fighter aircraft that could have actually defended the Reich. Speaking of fighter aircraft, The skies over Germany were witnessing a revolution that was equally terrifying and flawed. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet was a point defense interceptor that looked like a bat and flew like a bullet. It was the only rocket-powered fighter aircraft ever to see operational service. Powered by the Walter AWK 109-509 rocket engine, the Comet did not use aviation gas. It used a hypergolic mixture of two highly volatile liquids, C-Stoff and T-Stoff. When these two chemicals mixed in the combustion chamber, they ignited instantly, producing massive thrust. The Comet could climb at an astonishing 12,000 feet per minute, rocketing right through the formations of American B-17 flying fortresses. But this incredible performance came with a horrific price. The fuels were incredibly corrosive. If a fuel line ruptured, or if the pilot experienced a hard landing, the T-Stoff would literally dissolve human flesh in seconds. Furthermore, the aircraft only carried enough fuel for about 7.5 minutes of powered flight. The tactical execution was a nightmare. The Comet would blast up to 39,000 feet, make 1 or 2 diving passes at the American bombers, and then run out of fuel. The pilot was then forced to glide back to Earth as an unpowered, highly vulnerable glider. Its primary armament, two 30mm Mk108 cannons, fired a heavy, devastating explosive shell, but the muzzle velocity was painfully slow. Because the Comet was closing on the bombers at over 800 miles per hour, the pilot only had a fraction of a second to aim, fire, and pull away before colliding with the target. The weapon system was fundamentally mismatched with the speed of the aircraft. The Amid 262 Schwalbe, on the other hand, was a true combat-capable jet fighter, and it posed a very real threat to the American daylight bombing campaign. Powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojets, its swept wings and shark-like fuselage gave it a top speed of 540 miles per hour. In the hands of an elite unit like Jagdverband 44, commanded by the legendary fighter ace Adolf Galland, the Me-262 was lethal. They developed a tactic called the roller coaster attack. The jets would approach the American bomber boxes from the rear, diving down to build up extreme speed, then pulling up sharply to bleed off that speed, giving them a few extra seconds to ripple fire their R4M unguided air-to-air rockets. A single hit from an R4M rocket would completely obliterate a B-17. If the Me-262 was so heavily armed and so technologically superior, how did the United States Army Air Forces eventually neutralize it? The answer lies in American tactical adaptability and overwhelming numbers. We did not try to dogfight the Me-262 at 30,000 feet, because our P-51 Mustangs could not catch them in a straight line. Instead, American fighter groups adopted a ruthless tactic known as rat-catching. The early jet engines of the Me-262 were incredibly sluggish to spool up. If a German pilot slammed the throttle forward too quickly, the engine would flame out or catch fire. Therefore, the jets had to take off and land at very low speeds, flying in a long, predictable, and vulnerable glide path. American Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots would simply loiter over the German jet airfields at low altitude. When the Me-262s returned from a mission, out of fuel and out of ammunition, the American fighters would dive out of the sun and slaughter them right over the runway. The Germans were so desperate they had to assign conventional Focke-Wulf 190 fighters to fly cover over the airfields, just to protect the jets while they landed. The Wonder Weapon was defeated not by better technology, but by superior tactical exploitation of its mechanical weaknesses. Down in the mud and the blood of the ground war, the German obsession with technological superiority manifested in the form of heavy armor. By late 1944, the Panzerkampfwagen 6 OSV, known to history as the Tiger II or the King Tiger, was prowling the battlefields of Europe. This was a 75-ton behemoth, wrapped in sloped armor that was up to 7 inches thick on the front of the turret. It carried the devastating 88mm 43L 71 gun, a weapon so powerful it could punch straight through the frontal armor of an American Sherman tank from well over 2 miles away. On paper, in a one-on-one duel on an open firing range, the King Tiger was the most lethal tank on the planet. But wars are not fought on pristine firing ranges. They are fought in the freezing mud of the Ardennes forest and the ruined, narrow streets of European cities. The King Tiger was a logistical catastrophe. It was powered by a Maybach HL 230 V12 gasoline engine, which was the exact same engine used in the 45-ton Panther tank. Asking that engine to move 75 tons of steel meant the tank was chronically underpowered, sluggish, and prone to catastrophic transmission failures. Furthermore, it consumed gasoline at an eye-watering rate of roughly 1.5 gallons per mile. We can see the fatal flaws of this design doctrine perfectly illustrated during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the dense, snow-covered Ardennes forest, hoping to split the American and British armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The spearhead of this assault was Kampfgruppe Pieper, heavily equipped with King Tigers. The terrain was a nightmare of narrow, winding dirt roads flanked by dense pine trees and steep ravines. When a 75-ton King Tiger broke down on a single-lane forest road which happened constantly, it blocked the entire armored column behind it. American combat engineers simply blew the small stone bridges spanning the rivers, knowing that the King Tiger was far too heavy to cross standard military pontoon bridges. The German armoured spearhead literally ground to a halt, trapped in massive traffic jams, burning through their precious fuel reserves while idling in the freezing cold. Once the winter skies cleared, American P-47 Thunderbolts swarmed the stalled columns, dropping 500-pound bombs and firing high-velocity rockets into the thin top armor of the immobilized beasts. It is the exact same catastrophic miscalculation the French knights made at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The French had the heaviest, most impenetrable plate armor in the world, but they marched into deep, exhausting mud against English longbowmen, who were lightly equipped and highly mobile. The French knights exhausted themselves, sank into the mire, and were slaughtered by a cheaper, more agile force. The King Tiger was the plate armor of 1944, utterly invincible from the front, but entirely defeated by bad weather, broken bridges, and a severe lack of American gasoline. Even more absurd than the King Tiger was the Jagdtiger, a casemate tank destroyer built on the Tiger II chassis. It weighed a staggering 71 tons and mounted a monstrous 128mm naval gun. It was the heaviest armoured fighting vehicle used operationally during the Second World War. The recoil of the massive gun was so violent that the vehicle had to remain completely stationary to fire, and the crew had to manually load two separate pieces, the heavy projectile and the brass powder casing, for every single shot. In combat, the Jagdtiger was practically useless for offensive operations. During Operation Spring of Awakening in Hungary in 1945, the last major German offensive of the war, these massive vehicles simply sank up to their hulls in the spring mud. Crews were forced to abandon and scuttle their own wonder weapons by dropping thermite grenades down the gun barrels, simply because they ran out of gas or through a track in a ditch. The German industrial base had spent millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of man-hours building a handful of invincible bunkers on tracks, while the Americans and Soviets were flooding the zone with tens of thousands of reliable, fast, and easily repairable medium tanks. The tactical deployment of these wonder weapons reveals a fundamental breakdown in German strategic thinking. They were substituting engineering complexity for strategic reality. They built weapons designed for a perfect world that did not exist in 1944. They needed weapons that could survive in a world where the enemy owned the sky, where fuel was a luxury, and where the factories were being pounded into gravel every single night. Instead, they built fragile masterpieces that required pristine runways, highly refined chemicals, and perfect logistical support. The wonder weapons had failed to turn the tide, but they had unlocked a terrifying new era of warfare, proving that jet propulsion, guided missiles, and ballistic trajectories were not just science fiction. The Third Reich was in its final death throes, burning to the ground under the weight of Allied artillery and strategic bombers. But the technology they had birthed was far too valuable to be buried in the rubble of Berlin. As the American and British armies crossed the Rhine River in the west, and the Soviet Red Army smashed through the Silo Heights in the east, a new, highly classified and totally covert war was just beginning in the shadows. This covert war was not fought with tanks and artillery, but with intelligence officers, counterintelligence agents, and hastily assembled teams of American and Soviet scientists. As the conventional German military apparatus disintegrated, a frantic race began to capture the brilliant minds and the classified blueprints that had created the wonder weapons. The United States launched Operation Paperclip, a highly classified initiative spearheaded by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. The mission was simple: find the German scientists, secure their research, and get them out of Europe before the Soviet Union could get their hands on them. We knew that the alliance with Joseph Stalin was a marriage of convenience. And the moment the swastika was lowered over the Reichstag, the Iron Curtain would begin to fall. The technology that had failed to save Nazi Germany was about to become the foundational currency of the Cold War. Consider the desperate final days of Wernher von Braun and his V-2 rocket team. They were trapped in the Bavarian Alps, hiding from the rapidly advancing American army, but also terrified of the Soviet Smersh units that were hunting them from the east. Von Braun knew that if the Soviets captured him, he would likely be squeezed for information and then executed, or at best, sent to a frozen gulag to build rockets in a cage. He chose to surrender to the Americans. He sent his brother, Magnus, riding a bicycle down a mountain road to find an American-done anti-tank unit and negotiate a surrender. When the men of the U.S. 44th Infantry Division finally realized who they had captured, the intelligence community went into overdrive. Major Robert Staver of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps realized that the blueprints for the V-2 were hidden in an abandoned mine in the Harz Mountains, an area that was slated to be handed over to Soviet control in a matter of weeks. In a massive, frantic logistical operation, the U.S. Army secured 300 boxcars, loaded them with every V-2 component, blueprint, and tooling machine they could find, and shipped them west just days before the Red Army rolled in. We did not just capture a weapon, we captured a generational leap in aerospace engineering. To truly understand the failure of the Nazi Wunderwaffens, we have to look past the impressive technical specifications and analyze the multi-dimensional strategic environment in which they were deployed. Let us examine the cold, unforgiving mathematics of wartime economics. The V-2 rocket program is estimated to have cost the Third Reich roughly 3 billion Reichsmarks. To put that staggering number into perspective, that is roughly equivalent to the financial investment the United States made in the Manhattan Project. But look at the strategic return on investment. The Manhattan Project produced a true wonder weapon. An atomic bomb that instantly ended the war in the Pacific and fundamentally altered global geopolitics forever. The German V-2 program, for all its billions, delivered a total of roughly 3,000 tons of high explosives onto Allied targets over its entire operational lifespan. By 1944, Royal Air Force and the US 8th Air Force were dropping 3,000 tons of high explosives on Germany in a single afternoon. How do you justify bankrupting your national treasury for a ballistic missile that delivers less explosive yield in a year than a conventional bomber fleet delivers before lunch? You cannot. It was an act of economic suicide, driven by a political leadership that was entirely detached from the realities of industrial warfare. This brings us to a fundamental tactical lesson that militaries are still grappling with today: the danger of the silver bullet fallacy. The Germans believed that a technological marvel could compensate for a flawed grand strategy and a collapsing logistical tale. We have seen this exact same dangerous mindset infect our own military planning. Look at the United States military in the early years of the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, American defense planners were obsessed with the technological promise of guided air-to-air missiles. They believed that the era of the classic dogfight was over, and that aerial combat would be conducted entirely beyond visual range. As a result, they designed the F-4 Phantom, a massive, incredibly fast, twin-engine interceptor, and they intentionally left out an internal cannon. They armed it exclusively with the radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow and the heat-seeking AIM-9 Sidewinder. It was a marvel of modern engineering, a true American wonder weapon. But when those phantoms engaged in combat in the humid, turbulent skies over North Vietnam against cheap, mass-produced, and highly agile Soviet MiG-17s and MiG-21s, the reality of combat shattered the technological theory. The early missiles had terrible failure rates. The electronics malfunctioned in the tropical humidity. The rules of engagement forced American pilots to visually identify targets, negating their beyond visual range advantage. American pilots found themselves in tight, turning dogfights without a gun, being outmaneuvered by cheaper, simpler aircraft. The United States had to painfully relearn the basics, retrofitting gun pods onto the Phantoms and establishing the Top Gun School to teach fundamental combat geometry. Technology is an amplifier of sound doctrine. It is not a replacement for it. The Germans in 1944, much like the American planners in 1965, put their faith in the machine rather than the holistic combat system. Let us look at the logistical constraints of another German marvel, the Type 21 U-boat. This was the Electroboot, arguably the first true submarine in history. Prior to this, submarines were essentially surface ships that could dive for short periods to attack or hide. The Type 21 was designed to stay submerged for its entire patrol water. It had massive battery banks, an advanced snorkel system, and hydraulic torpedo reloaders that could fire a spread of 6 torpedoes in less than 20 minutes. It could travel at 15 knots underwater, which was faster than the American and British anti-submarine corvettes hunting it. On paper, this vessel could have severed the Atlantic supply lines and starved Great Britain. But how did the Germans try to build it? Because their shipyards were being pulverized by Allied bombers, they decided to build the submarine in modular sections across different inland factories, and then transport those sections to the coast for final assembly. It sounds like a brilliant, modern manufacturing concept. But modular construction requires absolute, microscopic quality control and standardized tolerances. When you are relying on slave labor, when your factories are being bombed, and when your steel is of degrading quality, tolerances vanish. When the massive sections of the Type 21 arrived at the shipyards, the hulls did not line up. The electrical wiring harnesses did not connect. The engineers had to practically rebuild the submarines on the slipways, wasting thousands of hours. Out of 118 Type 21 submarines built, only 2 ever conducted a combat patrol before the war ended. A weapon is only as good as the industrial base that supports it. We can draw a direct line from this logistical failure to the American Civil War. In the 1860s, the Union Army introduced the Spencer repeating rifle, a devastating weapon that could fire 7 rounds. In the time it took a Confederate soldier to reload a single shot into his muzzle-loaded musket. The Confederates managed to capture thousands of these Spencer rifles on the battlefield. but they were completely useless to the South. Why? Because the Spencer rifle required a highly specialized, self-contained copper rimfire cartridge. The agrarian South did not have the heavy industrial base, the precision tooling, or the raw copper reserves to mass-produce that specific ammunition. The Union had a wonder weapon, but more importantly, the Union had the factories in New England to feed it. The Confederates had the weapon, but no logistical tail, rendering it nothing more than an expensive club. The German military in World War II found themselves in the exact same position as the Confederacy. They had the Me-262 jet fighter, but they lacked the high-grade chromium to build reliable turbine blades, and they lacked the synthetic J-2 aviation fuel to fly them. They had the King Tiger tank, but they lacked the gasoline to move it and the heavy recovery vehicles to tow it when it inevitably broke down. The political environment of the Third Reich also guaranteed the failure of these programs. Hitler ran his government like a mafia boss, encouraging infighting and turf wars among his subordinates to ensure no one could challenge his absolute authority. This meant that the research and development of these weapons was heavily compartmentalized and highly toxic. The V-2 program, for example, was eventually hijacked by the SS under the command of General Hans Kammler. Kammler was a ruthless fanatic who cared nothing for engineering realities, only for meeting arbitrary production quotas through the brutal exploitation of concentration camp labor. When the military needed interceptors to defend the cities, Hitler demanded bombers to attack London. When the engineers needed time to test the aerodynamics of the V-1, the political leadership demanded immediate deployment. You cannot engineer a technological revolution when the scientists are terrified of being executed by the secret police for failing to deliver miracles on demand. Contrast this with the American Office of Scientific Research and Development, led by Vannevar Bush. The American system integrated civilian scientists, military brass, and industrial leaders into a unified, collaborative network. When the US military needed a proximity fuse to shoot down Japanese kamikazes, the scientific community mobilized, the factories retooled, and the weapon was delivered to the fleet seamlessly. The American system was a symphony. The German system was a knife fight in a burning building. Ultimately, the story of the Nazi Wunderwaffen is a story of catastrophic strategic delusion. They were the desperate, thrashing attempts of a dying regime to cheat death. The weapons themselves were brilliant, terrifying, and profoundly flawed. They came too late to change the outcome of the Second World War, but they arrived exactly on time to define the next 50 years of human history. The V-2 rocket did not save Berlin, but its direct descendant, the Redstone rocket, carried the first American into space, and the Saturn V carried us to the moon. The swept-wing aerodynamics of the Me-262 did not stop the 8th Air Force, but they were directly copied into the design of the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15, the two jets that would clash in the skies over Korea just 5 years later. The physical steel of the Wunderwaffen was melted down or left to rust, but the mathematics, the physics, and the terrifying potential of what they represented were absorbed by the victors. Technology, no matter how advanced, is merely a tool. It cannot manufacture courage, it cannot replace sound tactical doctrine, and it absolutely cannot substitute for the brutal, unglamorous reality of mass production and logistics. The Third Reich built weapons for a fantasy war that they wished they were fighting. The Allies built weapons for the gritty, muddy, blood-soaked war that actually existed, and that is why the Allies won. Thank you for stepping into the war room with us today. If you want to keep dissecting the tactics, the technology, and the hard truths of military history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like on the video. Now, I want to hear your tactical assessment in the comments below. Which German wonder weapon do you think had greatest impact on modern post-war military technology? Is it A, the V-2 ballistic missile and its role in the space race? Is it B, the Me-262 jet fighter and its influence on modern aviation? Or is it C, the Type 21 U-boat and the birth of the true modern submarine? Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments, and I will see you on the next briefing.